When it comes to drawing your own characters, I think there are three main challenges that tend to crop up. The first is that we need to create an interesting, compelling character to begin with. The second is that we need to learn to draw, obviously, so that we can draw that character from different angles and take on the various drawing challenges that they might pose. The third is that we need to make sure we can draw that character and make sure they actually look and feel the same from drawing to drawing from different angles. I think it's often this third challenge that's often the one that trips up the aspiring artist, especially when you're trying to create comics or other projects where you draw your characters again and again. In this video, I want to discuss how best to attack this problem, and I'll use the little Pinocchio character that I designed for the 2014 adaptation of Carlo Collodi's classic tale, The Adventures of Pinocchio, that I did with David Chauvel. Let's get started. Alright, my name's Tim McBurney and I've been a professional artist for 20 years and a professional drawing teacher for 10 years. I'm here to help you draw cool stuff from your imagination and master the craft of line and color illustration. Now, this is a task that we get tasked with, obviously, a lot when we're drawing comics. If we take a project like Pinocchio here, I obviously have to design the character. And you can see here, I'll bring up a version of the original design that I did that was the one I liked. I obviously did lots of different ones, but this was the one that I looked at and I really said, that's it, that's kind of what I want him to look like. Now again, there's a process for sort of turning that into a character that can be sort of drawn again and again. And it is a bit of an art, right? It's not a science. And what I want to talk about again in this video is a little bit of the subtleties and the mix of kind of technical craft stuff we do, a little bit more of the art stuff we do, where again, we're really trying to get into the emotional mindset of the character as well as just kind of draw them from, panel to panel and make sure that they proportionally look the same. But obviously, as you can see, we have to draw Pinocchio from different angles, make sure that he emotes and feels the same, make sure his proportions are the same, and make sure that we know how to draw him from many, many different angles. Now, if we look at some basic drawing academic study that we can do to get better at this, there's obviously a lot of stuff that exists that maybe doesn't deal with stylized cartoony characters, but deals with things like having to draw anatomy from realistic figures and replicate that from, again, illustration to illustration. So the typical way that we often solve this problem is by creating mannequins which help us gauge and control proportion from early on. And again, this is something that you'll see frequently talked about in Andrew Loomis's books and a lot of other sort of similar figure drawing books that are in the same tradition of constructive anatomy. Again, I think the real trick is to try and translate some of these concepts here to a more stylized character and look at how we can sort of adapt to these ideas, and hopefully I can give you some advice for how you can tackle one of these projects and again get that same sort of consistency when you're drawing a stylized character. Now, if you're struggling with this type of structural analytical figure drawing where we deal with proportion, etc., you might want to check out my free mini workshop, which covers the top 5 mistakes that aspiring artists tend to make when they are constructing heads and faces and trying to draw those with correct proportion. I go over those 5 top mistakes and how to avoid them, how to fix them. So hopefully that will provide you with a bit of extra information and shed some light on how these proportions and this analytical drawing can help us draw heads and faces and other things like anatomy and characters. Nice, cool, cartoony characters like this. So let's jump in. Okay, so ultimately the goal is to try and adapt some of that mannequinization of the human figure and try and create a little mannequin of Pinocchio. Now, Pinocchio is already a mannequin, but we still need to apply the basic same structural proportional analysis of what made that sort of first design work, and see if we can again create a simple glorified stick figure of him so that we can then redraw him. And again, that'll kind of help us block in the figure basically, and then start to act and add gesture to the figure. Before we do that though, let's sort of just get some groundwork out of the way, and we'll try and illustrate how these concepts function using a few different drawings. So if we start, let's start by attacking the human figure first. Now, in this case, this is a stylized version of a human, so it's not accurate or hyper-realistic to natural proportions, but it's close enough. The key here is that I can repeat and control these proportions from drawing to drawing. And it's important here when we're looking at drawing, again, just a simple 3/4 front-on view of a human figure, and we're just going to deal with the mannequin, right, which deals with the simple proportions, is that we want to have ourselves able to handle a specific task, which I think is really key to handling proportion from drawing to drawing, and that's that we're going to fit our character within a pre-existing space. This is why it's so important to understand proportions, is that we're actually going to often, when we are practically drawing comics or drawing other projects or drawing scenes, we actually need to fit that character within an existing space, not kind of just start with the head and kind of like hope that, you know, it'll sort of fit as we draw down. You can think of this challenge as similar to being able to draw a character that takes up most of a sheet of paper. This is often a real challenge for the beginner, but if you get it right, you get this nice large drawing again that sort of takes up most of the page, and you avoid things like running into issues where feet or arms kind of, you know, end up drawing off the page, as I'm sure you know can happen. That's quite easy to make that mistake when you're, you know, trying to sort of draw something. You start in one place and kind of you just keep going, and then you kind of run out of room. So this is a basic proportional drawing challenge, and part of learning proportion and anatomy this way helps us master this. This is one of the reasons that going to life drawing will be, you know, like beneficial in some ways, because even though, again, you may be more interested in learning to draw from your imagination, this helps you gauge proportion and think about composition and how to fill the page and how to make sure that, again, you don't run out of space. Again, it's all about composition and maximizing the size of the drawing on the page. This will help us later on when we're doing all sorts of things. Okay, so as I said, what we have here is a fairly sort of standard but cartoony version of the figure. Now, mostly what I'm trying to do here is create a rough version of the figure. Now again, the Loomis sort of mannequin has this kind of extended pectoral kind of like deltoid shoulder kind of thing. I don't normally actually put that in there, but again, I just sort of placed it in there so you can sort of see and match how I would sort of match that typical mannequin. But mostly what I'm trying to do is divide the figure into essentially sort of 8 heads there. I like to consider the figure to be divided halfway, just at the bottom of the pelvis. And that's, again, how I sort of simplify things. Now, that essentially sort of makes the figure broken down into sort of 2 sections in my sort of mind. The top torso and head section and the bottom leg section. The bottom leg section, essentially I'm just initially dividing where the knee joint is as being, you know, again, roughly sort of halfway between the bottom of the pelvis and the bottom of the foot there. So I've sort of got, again, that bottom section divided up into 2, and this top section is divided into 4 quadrants that are roughly the size of the kind of skull or head there. Again, the things that I'm trying to pay attention to are when we're sort of, you know, just drawing a standard figure like this, are things like, again, where does the bottom of the rib cage meet other elements. I often find that it's really helpful just as a marker to understand that the bottom of the rib cage will line up with where the navel is, and that also kind of tends to line up where the elbow is. So I'm sort of paying attention to that. I'm trying to find that, again, sort of 1, 2, 3. That third marker, we place the head in that sort of first marker there. Again, just roughly, probably if this was a character in Pinocchio, I'd make the head a little bit bigger. The proportions here are probably a little bit more realistic than are in that book for the human characters there. So I'm paying attention to, again, filling the face within that first, finding the torso and rib cage. Again, that sort of torso rib cage sort of egg shape is again gonna sort of start just a little bit below that kind of first sort of quadrant there, right? Again, it's not going to quite meet the chin. There's a separation between the chin and, again, where that sort of rib cage will meet. But again, I'm thinking about that rib cage hitting the bottom of that sort of third quadrant, and again, there being these sort of hip bones and those other sort of pelvic areas being essentially just sort of creating this little gap between the bottom of the rib cage and again the top of those. So again, a simple proportional breakdown. That's kind of what I'm thinking as I do this. This kind of is my simplified version of a standard human mannequin. It's kind of a little bit based on the heroic sort of 8 heads tall mannequin that you would kind of normally see. And again, I'm just sort of making it quite simple for me to get to a point where I've got all of those limbs blocked in. Again, it's designed, not so that I'm going to be able to get a highly accurate, anatomically 100% correct figure at the end of it. It's mostly based in there so that I can get the proportions roughed in quickly. And again, that kind of division is just an easy way for me to remember it. Let's look at how we might draw Pinocchio using a similar type of system. So with Pinocchio, he's defined a little bit differently in terms of head to body proportions, but there's some similar markers in there that sort of define how things are aligned. And I kind of started off sort of saying, oh, he's like 3 heads high, maybe he's 4 heads high. In the end, I sort of left the concept of, the head height being, like a major sort of marker. And again, I sort of ended up with something that's a little bit kind of rougher because he doesn't quite fit 3 or 4 heads high. He's a little bit in between. But that is the general idea. We're using a very, very simple, similar system whereby we define space that he's going to fit into. And then after that, we divide that space up into essentially 3 different sections, 3 proportional kind of markers. And then I place more or less roughly the head in the top one, the torso in the middle one, and the legs in the bottom one. But again, it's not 100% important that this character is, always, analytically, proportionally 100% accurate all the time. This is mostly a guide. All right, and in a similar way to the human figure, again, what I'm trying to do is fit him within a space. And I'm, again, just eyeballing 3, all right, 1, 2, 3 separate proportional measurements that I sort of fit him into. But as you can kind of see, what I tend to do is, again, his torso doesn't quite take up most of that sort of third sort of quadrant, right? And again, his sort of head, one of the things we need to really pay attention to Pinocchio is that, again, his neck is not too long, right? So his neck needs to sort of be quite sort of short. Again, that sort of torso there is taking up not quite all of that sort of third proportion. Again, if I'm sort of trying to draw him and sort of really get it all kind of working properly. And again, I'm just sort of dividing up, again, this point here, right? That essentially dividing up that sort of third proportion in the middle. And that's where his sort of knee goes. So again, similar idea. Again, the arm, what I'm doing is I'm just making sure that the hand comes in sort of above this knee. and then I'm sort of dividing that arm right in half, and as you can kind of see there, again, it kind of tends to be coming in just about there, right? So kind of quite low on that torso. And again, all of these are proportional markers that I sort of memorize. Now, I don't have to teach this, right? I'm not trying to explain how to draw anatomy or, you know, like human anatomy. So this really is just for me. It doesn't have to be a complete system. Yours doesn't have to be a complete system. You don't have to answer to anyone. These things are really just here to help you understand how your character sort of functions. And again, it took me a while to figure out exactly how and why certain little proportional markers that I would sort of put in would really kind of, you know, shift him away from that sort of traditional character, the original sort of design that I did. But again, that's part of the process. That's part of you figuring out how your design functions and which little bits you need as part of your mannequin to make this drawing work, again, when you're just sort of sketching and blocking it in. Okay, so let's go through some of the theory about, again, what the mannequin actually is and how we sort of apply it and where it fits into the grand scheme of drawing. So I've sort of drawn these, again, these are not to scale, and again, they're sort of on different bits of paper. But if we look at the basic idea of what we're after with a mannequin, we're typically after getting the most proportion and structure that is really key to the character onto the page with the least amount of effort. So if we have our sort of typical, let's get a sharper pencil, if we have our typical human proportions versus our Pinocchio proportions, what we're doing again is just working with our mannequin. And again, the mannequin is essentially a glorified stick figure. So again, let's quickly put these in. All right, so this is the basic diagrammatic version of this. And again, most of the drawings I'm going to be doing in this tutorial, and really in all the tutorials I'm doing like this, are really just for diagrammatic purposes only. I'm not always trying to draw the prettiest pictures here. Again, I feel like that head could probably be a little bit bigger. Now, the key to what we're doing is that we're making glorified stick figures. That really is what we're trying to do. And we kind of have basically just a stick figure, except that when you're drawing, it can be very handy to add some basic structure or form that without that form, it's very hard to tell whether or not your character is kind of on model, is proportionally working, is kind of looking in the right direction. And that's where, again, you have, you know, the basic sort of structural form of the skull. We've got the form of the torso. We've got the sort of pelvic area. And we tend to block those in and include them as part of our stick figure so that, again, because, again, doing that actually makes it quicker than if you're just doing a stick figure, because putting in these sort of basic geometric forms actually makes the drawing process a lot simpler and gives us a much more functional drawing. Same with Pinocchio. The fundamental thing that's really important with Pinocchio's head, again, is to think about sort of where his nose is sort of pointing, and we can actually, you know, get quite a lot of information just from sort of putting in the nose and the eye. We can pose him quite effectively doing that. Other major forms, again, there's the little sort of bean sort of box of his torso is quite important. We can sort of squash and stretch that and give him a lot of sort of character, right? Depending on sort of what direction that's going and where the face is and the head is in relation to that. Also, adding his little poncho cape greatly helps to mass out his sort of form. So that's something that, although it's not really often key to, you know, posing him, I'd often make sure I add that little cape, because if I don't, it can sometimes make him feel like, even though I've drawn it properly, he's not a model, because it's such a big part of his design. So again, this is where you have to sort of think about your character and how do they break down, which proportional elements are there. Now, the important thing here is to separate the idea of proportion and structure. So if we think about structure, structure is where, again, for the human figure and the Pinocchio figure, again, we're going to add these concepts of structure. And that is where we have our basic cube/box and our sphere and our cone and our cylinder. For some reason I always call cones cylinders. I might have called that a cylinder, I forget. So we got these basic forms, and obviously what we're going to do is we're going to take our stick figure, the proportional stick figure, and we're going to add these extra geometric forms. So, as part of our sort of structural drawing process. So for instance, Pinocchio is going to have his sort of little bean-shaped torso, right? And I'm going to find the form for that, right? We're going to put in the extra kind of spheres for those kind of joints. And as part of that drawing process, I'm essentially going to make, right, all of those limbs into boxes, right? I'm going to draw this out. The same with his nose. I'm going to, sort of make it, essentially it is just sort of one big box, right? But I'm going to kind of twist it, right? I'm going to sort of give it a little bit of, again, squash and stretch, a bit of sort of energy, right? It's often a little bit sort of bent. It has some emotion to it. So again, we're going to add this structure, and that's going to be something we do as part of the process of drawing either Pinocchio or the human anatomy figure. The stick figure is there to kind of say, well, is there a really, really simple version of some of this that we can add that will help us get there sooner? Because as I said, and this is really, really important to understand, we need to make sure that the proportions are accurate. But as I said before, sometimes I would actually get these proportions right, but because I sort of didn't have again, the cape on or some other little thing there, he kind of still didn't look like Pinocchio. And that, I think, is something you'll find, depending on, the general proportion of your character, is you need to make sure that the mannequin you create supports that character and allows you to place them and tell how they're acting when you're at the sort of earliest, sketchiest stage. So that's really what's happening here. This is the function. This is, again, trying to illustrate and simplify what's going on there. We're taking stick figures, and we're sort of just amping them up. We're making them a little bit better, but not just because, again, we want to draw these kind of fancy things. We're doing it because adding those actually is more effective and saves more time and makes the process more fun. When you are drawing your own realistic style anatomy, your need for accuracy here, and again, your need for accuracy in general, will depend what your goals are, how realistic you need your art to be, and maybe learning them from a more analytical, academic, realistic standpoint. Even if you do want to draw cartoony stuff, that can be useful. Now, I don't mean getting into, spending 8 hours doing, detailed life drawings from models or anything like that. I just mean that, again, paying attention to the realistic proportions and studying them can be really helpful. It's helpful in the following way. It allows you to really focus and learn these proportions properly, and the advantage of picking something that does exist and is sort of a known quantity as opposed to your own sort of stylistic version is that it's really easy to see where you're coming short, where you're naturally skipping steps or not understanding the actual measurements. And essentially, because you're aiming with that study for an accurate representation of something that is predefined, that process of you trying to get to that point will weed out a lot of bad habits you might have built up over the years, and it's a great way of perfecting your craft. Again, the way we actually apply these things can be more intuitive and natural once they're properly integrated and understood. You can be a little bit looser with those proportional markers. You can see that, again, I'm not measuring everything out with a ruler, but I have made a little bit of a study of the basic anatomical proportions from an academic standpoint, and that actually, ironically and counterintuitively, allows me to be more sort of sketchy while maintaining a some sort of relative sense of sort of realistic proportion. So again, the more analytical your study is with all drawing, the more intuitive and expressive and sort of non-conscious your actual practice can be. Now, the trick with all of this proportional mannequinization is that it sounds really good from a logical standpoint. It sounds really easy. It sounds like, well, of course, we just sort of figure out what all the proportions are, and then we can just draw it every time. And again, I think that sort of is true, but these things often sound like they're a little bit too much of a great sort of logical step. And when you're watching a video like this, it can seem like, well, of course, that's the answer. That's a really sort of good thing to do. What could go wrong? Look, as always, what we're going to be doing here by sort of studying proportion and sort of figuring out the proportions of your character is that we're creating a sort of very logical external version of your character. And this allows you to access those subtle details when we're in that kind of logical editing mindset, when we're thinking. So it's really good to have this as a tool that you use to mannequinize your own character, because it means when stuff goes wrong, you can refer back to it. When things go wrong, we get put into an analytical mindset. We often come out of drawing flow. We get a little bit frustrated. And that's where having these things that really define the proportion can be really useful, because you can go back and say, where did I go wrong? Oh, look, I see an obvious error here that I can sort of assess from an analytical point of view. You know, I've got the proportions wrong, and that can often fix it. And in many cases, we are making very simple mistakes like that when we go to draw the character and they don't turn out perfectly identical or looking like the character should. So these mannequins are good for troubleshooting. They're good for checking if you've missed something. They're good for if something's going wrong. But I believe it's not something where we should feel tied down to our own design here, and especially not in the beginning. It can take a while to really understand what makes your character tick, and you do need to do that internally and play around and experiment on the page. For me, the true version of Pinocchio resides in my subconscious, and there he exists part in visual form, part in this set of proportions and measurements that are sort of analytical, but he also exists there as an emotional being and to some degree as a real little guy running around in my head. Where mannequins come in really handy is less when we're trying to sort of nail millimeter perfect model sheet style drawings or trying to get stuff, exactly right. They're more useful for getting most of the information on the page in a really small amount of time. This allows us to use a simplified version of our internal character that we can sketch with and actually make it real and put it on the page. And the quicker we can do that and the simpler we can do that, the easier it is to modify and perfect each drawing from the baseline, to refine our acting through our characters using these little kind of mannequinized, sketchy versions. The quicker and easier we can iterate and adjust poses and subtle acting cues, the more time we can spend on refining those small details. Now, in general, I think drawing is a refinement process. As with a lot of art, we start with big strokes and refine to smaller ones. The big strokes are hard to change once we've moved on, so getting them right in the beginning is key, and that's where a good mannequin comes in really handy. It allows us to act through our drawings. Now, the other important thing that it does is if we understand not just proportion of our character's body parts or a single character's body parts, but how their overall proportion relates to other things in the world, such as other characters, other parts of the environment, or props, etc. Let's take, for example, if we're drawing Pinocchio in a scene here. We can't just start with a head, work our way down, and hope for the best. We have to consider the precise placement and size of the character within the scene. And often this is predefined at the thumbnail or the storyboard phase. We have to consider word balloon placement, other actions and characters within the scene which might actually need to be in a particular spot purely to make the text and dialogue sequence work. One of the trickiest challenges artists face early on is drawing these types of images, these scenes, images with multiple characters interacting with each other, with props, or the environment. If we get used to thinking in terms of proportion as a division of existing space and measuring all our characters at the mannequin phase, so even if you don't need to, if you get used to fitting your characters within an existing space as opposed to, again, just drawing the head and sort of working your way down and hoping for the best, this doesn't really help us to draw the single character that much. Again, you can probably get by without doing that, without worrying about this idea of measuring within a space or placing the character on the page in a particular way. But if you get used to doing this, it will really help you when you come to drawing these scenes. You can see that here, if we fit Pinocchio within an existing space like this, then it means we can position that existing space very easily and make sure that he is in a nice spot relative to the word balloons and the other environmental elements. We can even draw extra characters quite simply using this same technique. Let's add another Pinocchio to the scene here. We can track his proportion and match it relatively easily using simple perspective and form drawing techniques. We just carry across his overall height and track that within the scene. Again, I'm not using any complicated perspective to do this. I'm just sort of imagining the space and visualizing his height and making sure that we carry it across to his new position. And then we just draw him again, paying attention, especially in this case, I would say, to his head size as a key indicator to track and make sure the proportion feels the same. This is one of the reasons that learning fundamental perspective comes in really handy. Even if you aren't drawing buildings or other complicated technical things, all of these related elements have underlying structure based in the three-dimensional world. So each Pinocchio in the scene, the rocks, all exist, and there is perspective that kind of underlies them, even if it isn't a linear perspective where we're drawing buildings. This allows us to match roughly his proportion to the rest of the Pinocchios. We can even draw another one, and in this case, Pinocchio might be over here somewhere climbing on some rocks. So in this case, he's not upright. It's a lot harder for us to use the height and match the perspective that way, carry over his overall height within the space, and use that as a really accurate way of drawing in his proportions. But I can actually use his basic head size, which in this drawing is quite easy to gauge because they're all sort of relatively equal in their sort of distance from our imaginary camera. There's not a lot of foreshortening involved. And again, in this case, as with a lot of drawing, you have to find the easiest way to get proportion and solve the drawing problem based on the scenario, based on each drawing, because it's not a matter of there being a right way to do any of these things that is inherently superior. The superior way is the easiest way where we have to use the least amount of it possible. So again, I can just use that big old head of his and make sure it matches roughly the other characters. And then, because I know the relative proportion of his other body parts relative to the head, it makes it quite easy to draw in this third Pinocchio and have him, in a non-upright position, but still make him feel as if he's the same size. It's important to understand that much of the power in thinking heavily about proportion and memorizing these markers is in the fact that drawing and perspective are not linear equations. So I can start with the head and I can finish with the foot, or we can start with the ear and finish with the hand. As long as we understand how they relate to each other, we can draw out from anywhere and get a decent block in of our character. I often talk about it being important to fit the character within a space, and I think that's a fundamental skill that often we're trying to achieve, where again, it's not that we need to start from the foot and go up to the head. And as I've said, we don't want to just start with the head and work our way down and hope for the best, but you can always start with the head and work your way down as long as you understand what you're trying to do. Again, often the skill that is most important, as I keep saying, is being able to fit the character within a particular space. That's what will allow you to draw scenes with lots of characters. Obviously, there are always easier and more effective ways to start a particular drawing, a unique drawing, to get the pose and the particular way that that character is feeling. You might want to start with the main sort of gesture of the figure to get a feeling of, again, what their action is like. Starting with the torso in some of those cases might be the most effective thing. The key is we don't need to feel tied down to any particular sequence. Often we need to just, draw a foot or a hand, disembodied from anything else, because that's what we need for a panel. Maybe, again, we're looking at a character and we only see part of them, and, the background is sort of further forward in the scene, so we don't need to draw the whole character. But again, understanding proportion means that it's easy to guess where those things are going to be in relation to each other. So hopefully this gives you a good understanding of how mannequins can help your character designs and drawing. Remember, everything is a mix of technical and intuitive drawing. The technical things are great for helping us think through our work and edit effectively, but they're there to help back us up, not run the show. Remember that most of the drawing happens in our subconscious, and the most important thing to get right is to make the character look and feel like they are the same from drawing to drawing. And as long as that happens, you have succeeded. If you're struggling with this type of structural proportion, this style of drawing where we're being a little bit more analytical, we're drawing through, finding these proportional markers, feel free to check out my free mini workshop that covers the top 5 head mistakes that aspiring artists tend to make and how to avoid them. It'll hopefully shed a bit of extra light on how some of these things that I've talked about in this video work, and how studying proportions can help us draw, and how they can help us to troubleshoot problems within our heads and faces. That will be in the description. Check it out. Anyway, that's all I've got. Happy drawing. Catch you around.